Great, all right, so let's get started. So my name is Erik Dahl. I'm an independent designer and researcher, but today I want to talk about something a little bit different. It's sort of the other half of my design career, which is involved with community development, both with the IxDA at a local level and now at a global level, as well as a conference that I put on and some other things that I do. And so I want us to sort of take a step back from our everyday lives. Let's put our computers aside, and I want to reflect on the other half of our lives that involve our design careers, right? And so I just want you to sort of entertain me for the next 45 minutes as we sort of explore this other half of our lives that is away from the computer. So I'm going to do a couple different activities as we go through this, and I want you just to take a moment and close your eyes and think back through your life and think about the time when you were maybe happiest. What was the happiest moment in your life? It might have been recently, it might have been in your childhood, and just try to come up with that time, and I'll give you a minute to do that. All right, does everyone have something in your mind? Now, open your eyes, maybe turn to your neighbor, turn to a group of people around you, and just sort of share that with each other. Share what that happiest moment in your life was. All right, so hopefully everyone had lots of things to talk about. I want to keep this moving, but how many people, just by a show of hands, how many people, the happiest moment of your life involved like a mobile device or a piece of software? Raise your hands. Anyone? All right. How many people, the happiest moment of your life involved like other people, friends, family, coworkers? Right, so that's what I expected. So most people, right, the things that make us happy in life aren't these devices that we make, aren't the software that we make, but it's the people around us. But we spend so much time and effort in our life devoted to making these things, making these products, but I don't think we spend enough time thinking about how do we build better relationships, how do we make our communities stronger. So that's where I want to spend the next several minutes talking about with you. I want to start by telling you a story of when this kind of was a realization for me. This was 2009. I was living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was working at a design consultancy called Maya Design. And I had been there for about 5 years, and this was March of 2009. I'm not sure what the economy was like here, but in the States, the economy was in the toilet. It wasn't doing very well. I think we were at a consultancy. I think we hadn't signed a new contract in like 5 or 6 months. So if you've ever worked in a consultancy, typically you have 3 months out, and then you start losing money. So we started losing money. We had a big round of layoffs. So March of 2009, I was laid off. I was unemployed. And to make matters worse, my wife was 8 months pregnant with our second child. And so I was like, oh shit, what am I supposed to do, right? This has never happened to me before. I knew it happened to lots of people, but I realized at that moment that I didn't really have a community outside of my coworkers. Everyone I knew in Pittsburgh were people I worked with, and they couldn't really help me get a job because I just got laid off there. And no one in Pittsburgh was hiring, so I reached out to lots of different people and did what I could, and it was that moment that sort of triggered, like, I need a bigger network of friends and colleagues and coworkers than just the people I'm working with day to day. So I started engaging the larger community. I ended up moving to Columbus. I'd never been to this city before, but there was a job there, and I was looking for a little stability in my life, given that my daughter had just been born. And so we ended up in Pittsburgh, or in Columbus. And when we moved to Columbus, I vowed to make a change, and I said to myself, if we're going to live in this city, I'm going to make it the city that I want to live in. I'm going to make it the community that I want to live in. Even if it's not there, I'm going to help create that. And so that's what I did. I started working at a place. Kendra was actually there, who spoke yesterday, and we worked together for a little bit, and she was running the local IxDA chapter in Columbus. She ended up moving to San Francisco. I took on the local IxDA group and started to build that out. I also started a conference while I was there called the Midwest UX Conference, which is a regional IxDA conference. And the reason I called this a homecoming was because the seed of that conference was really planted by what you guys are doing here in South America with Interaction South America. I was at a conference in Interaction in Savannah, and I heard about what you guys were doing down here, and I said, that's what I want to do. I want to have a conference like this in my region to help uplift my region, help people there understand what design is and sort of get the message out and be a platform. So thank you for doing what you're doing down here that inspired me to do what I'm doing in Columbus. So what is a community? Again, I want to tell you a little story about community. So this may look like just a Little League baseball game, but to me, when I look at this picture, I see community. So that's my son there, and that's not me. That's some other guy. I really don't know who he is. He's another dad. But my son's about to go up to bat, and I grew up playing soccer. I didn't play baseball. And so I'm not a really good mentor for him as a baseball coach, right? And so, he's not that great. So this guy just stepped up and he's like, hey, I'm going to give you some pointers and give you some advice and give you some tips on what to do and sort of how to play and how to bat. And so for me, this is community, and this is what it's about. It's about having common values and sort of a shared vision for what you want to do so we can all work together to get someplace that we couldn't otherwise. And so for me, I think of community as essentially a social infrastructure supporting and enabling human action. It's the things that allow us to be better than ourselves. So I think just keep this in mind, this sort of definition of community as we move forward. So before I got into design and technology, I studied anthropology. And so I often see things through the lens of culture. And so not surprisingly, when I think about community, I think about culture as well. So when I think about culture, I think one of the important things to remember is there's this reciprocal relationship. There's this feedback between culture and ourselves. We create the culture that we live in, but that culture also impacts and influences who we are and what we do. So let's talk a little bit about it, just a quick definition of culture. This is from James Spradley. Breaks it down into simple building blocks: behavior, knowledge, and artifacts. It's what we do, what we know, and what we make and use. And I think if we get our heads around this, it's sort of a way to just understand what the building blocks of culture are. We can look at some more involved definitions of culture. I'm not going to go through and read all of these, but they talk about meaning making and how do we understand the world around us and how do we make meaning of things. Talking about culture as interpretive, right? It's not just black and white, it's how we interpret the world and how we make sense of the world. But it's also about this sort of shared interpretation and this shared meaning making and giving messages back and forth and being able to communicate with each other. And it's culture that allows us to do these things. So when I think about culture, I want you to remember this idea that culture is interpretive and generative. It's not taxonomic. It's not just a catalog of the things that we believe and the things that we do and make. But it's this sort of living thing that creates new things. And our communities are really sites or engines of cultural production. They're there and they make all this stuff for us, and they impact us and make us who we are. There's some recent studies done by Joe Henrik, who's a researcher out at the University of British Columbia, that's sort of changing the way a lot of social scientists are thinking about how culture influences us. And just like architecture and language, those things influence our cognition. I think they're relatively understood that they do that. But now we're starting to understand that culture has a strong impact on our cognition as well. And so he essentially did these ultimatum games cross-culturally. So what that means is he would go into a place and have two participants. He would essentially give them what's equivalent to whatever their day's wages were. And he'd give it to the first participant, and their job was to distribute the money evenly between the two participants, between themselves and the other person. And they could do it whatever they wanted. They could keep 100% for themselves, or they could give 100% to the second participant, or they could split it 50-50, or any other distribution. And then the second participant essentially had veto power. They could say, yes, I accept that distribution, and then the two people would get the money. Or they could say, nope, I don't like that distribution, and no one would get the money. And so what we see in America, what would typically happen is that people would do a 50-50 split, and then they would accept the money. And if the first person said, I'm going to take 60 or 70%, I'm only going to give you, 40 or 30%, they would refuse and veto the distribution and say, no, out of spite or out of malice, none of us are going to get money because I don't like that you did that. But that wasn't what happens everywhere, right? And so you have cultures that have a history of gift giving or reciprocity, and those people, those initial people would give 60, 70% to the second participant, but those second people would then refuse the gift, and they would say, no, I don't want to do this deal, because they knew that came with obligation. And so there's lots of other variations, but the idea here is that the culture that you live in, the communities that you keep, influences how you think and the behavior you take and the actions that you take. And so I think it's important that we understand and think and reflect on the communities that we're part of, because they're really shaping the decisions that we're making and the behaviors that we're taking. So I want to say a few words about this idea of problem finding as it relates to communities. I'm a big fan of Dan Pink. If any of you have read any of his books, I want to talk a little bit about a passage from his most recent book, To Sell is Human. And I won't make you read it, I'll tell you what it says. But basically, he's recounting a story, a study that was done by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's best known for his book Flow, done in the mid-'60s, where he took a bunch of art students, and he had two tables set up. And he had about 27 objects on the first table. The art students would come in, and their assignment was essentially to draw a still life. So what they found was that there were essentially two behavior groups that came out of this study. So some art students would come in, they would select an object from the first table, they would bring it over to the second table, and they would put it down, and then they would draw their still life, and they were done. The second group of students had a slightly different behavior. They would come in and they would maybe circle the table, they would pick up the objects, sort of compare them, investigate them, finally select some objects, bring them over to the second table, they'd place them down, maybe rearrange them a little bit, and then they would do the drawing. So ultimately both groups were drawing the still life, but they were doing it in different ways. He called the first group problem solvers, and he called the second group problem finders. And what's interesting is that fundamentally, while the behavior was different, they were asking different questions. The problem solvers were asking the question, how do I do good work? How do I execute a good still life? While the problem finders were asking a slightly different question first. They're asking, what is good work? What is good still life? And then, yes, how do I execute it? How do I draw it? So why do I tell you this, right? What does this matter to us as stewards of our communities, as members of these communities? I think it poses two questions for us that are important to constantly be thinking about and reflecting on. That's how do we craft good communities? But more importantly, what is a good community? What do I want from my community? And how do I want to make this thing to then ultimately make me better? And I don't have the answers for that. I think that's something that we all need to look into ourselves, understand what we want, and then express that out as we jointly make these communities together. All right, so if we could have the lights again, I want to do a quick activity, and I want you to think about, why do you join communities? So there's three questions that I want you to talk to your neighbors about. Why do you join communities? Why do you stay in or leave communities that you're in? And then if you do become a leader in those communities, why did you do that? And if you didn't, what kept you from doing that? So go ahead and turn to your neighbors and sort of talk about those things. Again, it's why did you join, why did you stay or leave, and then why did you lead or not? And it might be helpful to think about, maybe these are professional communities, but it could be otherwise. So did everyone have time to share? Does anyone need more time? Raise your hand if you need some more time. All right, I'll give you another 30 seconds or so to wrap up. Yeah, so why did you join communities? Why did you stay or leave? And then if you did lead communities, why did you become a leader? And if you didn't, what kept you from being a leader? A lot of the things that we hear, right, are ultimately, how can I find value? I'm looking for value, whether it's I want to find partners or colleagues, I want to get information. But ultimately, people, when I ask this question, people are looking for some sort of value. And then why do people stay or leave? It's typically because they're either not finding this value anymore, or it's still expressing value to them. I think the leadership question, I typically get different answers. And the reason why people don't step up to leadership, a lot of times it's around fear, or it's around people not thinking that they're senior enough to do it, or they don't have enough experience. So I want to talk about some of these things as we move forward with the rest of this talk. So I I want to spend the second half of this talk describing sort of 6 themes that I've seen in the community work that I've done, and we'll go through each one of these, and then we'll wrap things up. So the first one is this idea of moving from a posture of being passive to an active posture and an active engagement with community. And there's a quote by Michael Dahl, and this wasn't specifically about communities, but I think it gets at the idea. We tend to sit back and allow the heroic innovations of others to justify our own creative passivity. And I'm standing up here as a victim of this as well, right? I do this all the time. I consume other people's creativity. We're all doing this, right? We're all sitting in here and listening up to someone talk on the stage. I think it's natural and it's human nature for us to be passive at moments, to consume other people's creativity. But I think there needs to be times in our lives where we're all actively contributing. We're not just sitting back and consuming everyone else's activity, and we're not just passively being consumers of all this stuff, whether it's in our communities or whether it's how we purchase and consume products. I think we need to express our own activity and our own creativity. Otherwise, I think we're just ceding it to other people, and we're not taking our own power into account. So one of the ways that I've done this is, again, to this conference that I started, and it was a way for me. I saw a need in a vacuum, and I didn't want to wait for someone else to do it. I said, this is what I want. This is the community that I want to live in, so I'm going to create this conference. This is a photo from just last month when we had it in Indianapolis. We're going on our 5th year. It'll be in Pittsburgh next year. And it's amazing that people come out to this. I'm still amazed every year that we sort of do this thing and people enjoy it. But one of the things I want you to take away from this is that it's a conference and it's in its 4th year, but when it started, like, we had nothing. We bootstrapped it. We found a venue that was essentially free. There were times where we were afraid we were going to finish and we were going to have credit card debt because we had to pay for everything ourselves initially before we got money coming in. But you can do these things, right? Start small and grow it. You don't have to start big, right? So take these incremental steps to get where you want to go. A friend of mine in Pittsburgh started what's called the Bearstown Social Club. And this looked great, but it really all it is just some lights and some picnic tables in an empty lot between 2 warehouses. And they set this up and just put up sort of a fence, and they sold $5 memberships, and you can come in and you can drink beer in there, bring your own beer in. They have food trucks that come. But it's just a way to sort of bring the community together, and it didn't exist. And so he said, I'm going to create it, and I'm going to make it. And there's really very little overhead to it, but he's creating the community that he wants to live in. And I think that's what we all need to do, is to create our own path and make the world that we want to live in. But one of the things that is required of us if we want to do that is we have to have a vision for the future that we want to live in. And without that vision for the future, it's really hard to sort of make your own path. It's sort of hard to move forward. And I think Christina talked about this yesterday with her OKRs, right? What's your mission? What's your North Star? What do you want to do with your life? And I would sort of reframe that question and ask you, what do you want your communities to be like? What is it that they're not doing now that you want them to be? And I would challenge you to think about that and answer those questions, and then try to move forward and make the communities that you want to live in. So I'll give you a minute or two, again, to sort of want to share this with your neighbors. If you have a vision for the future that you want to create, take a minute and share it with your neighbors. And if you don't, that might be something that's hard. Then ask the question, what's missing in your current community? What are your pain points? What do you wish you had that you don't currently have? So take a minute and share that again with your neighbors. All right, so why don't we try to bring it back? And I know that's not enough time to sort of dig into all of these things, but maybe you had an opportunity to hear a spark of someone's idea for their future, or maybe you had a chance to start to share some of the problems that you see with your own communities, that maybe we can continue this conversation on the break and in the hallway and after the conference. So great, so now we have this vision for the future maybe, or at least we know some problems that we want to resolve. We want to change our behavior and do something different. But that change is not always easy to do. So I want to tell you just a quick story around something that happened to me recently. So about a month ago, I ran a half marathon for the first time. So that's 13 miles. Before, like 4 or 5 months ago, the farthest I had run was 3 miles, right? 5K, 5 kilometers. And I thought this was insurmountable. How can I run this half marathon? I'd never run that far in my life. But I read some interesting research around this sort of relationship between effort and identity. And I think we typically relate effort creates identity, right? You put in the effort, and after you put in enough effort, you have this new identity, for me, of a runner, someone that runs. But the research says if you can appropriate the identity first, then the effort, you don't have to put in all the effort, and it becomes easier to do, right? And so the effort, if you appropriate the identity first, the effort becomes a rewarding and sort of a feedback loop of the identity you already have as a runner, as opposed to being an effort to try to change something, and the effort that you're putting in is moving against your old identity of someone that sits on the couch. So one of the things you have to do is to visualize this and sort of tell your story. So what I did to sort of remind myself that, hey, I'm a runner now, and that's what I do. I get up and run in the morning, is I had my shoes right next to my bed, sort of on a little box, so almost like an altar, right, a little pedestal there. So every time I would get up out of bed, the first thing I would see, whether I was running that day or not, were my shoes, to remind myself, hey, this is what you do now. You get up and you go running. So that when it was cold outside or it was raining outside and I didn't want to go running, that's just what I do. I'm a runner now. I go running. So I had already appropriated that identity, and then the effort to actually make that happen was really easy. So I think you have to think about what's the identity that you want to have in the future, and visualize that for yourselves and pretend that you're already there. And then the effort that it's going to take to get there is just going to reinforce that. All right, so the next thing is communities need facilitators, not just leaders. I think a lot of people get hung up on leadership, but I like to think of it as being a facilitator. You can be a space maker, a path clearer, a friction reducer, just be an enabler of other people. You don't have to be a leader. You don't have to take on all of the responsibilities of leading a community or leading a group, but just do a little bit of effort to make space for other people to do something. Take the opportunity to make other people great. And when I think about this, I'm often reminded of the Richard Saul Wurman quote about Charles Eames, where he says, if you sell your expertise, you have a limited repertoire, but if you sell your ignorance, you have an unlimited repertoire. So very simply, there's a small set of things that I have gained expertise around, but there's a huge amount of things that I'm completely ignorant of, but I'm interested in, and I'm curious. And this is how I've approached my design work, is I try to find things I'm interested in and then get people to pay me to help them sort of figure it out and discover it, and I can learn on the way. But I don't come in and say, hey, I'm an expert, I know how to do this and I've done it before. I come in and say, hey, I've tackled problems before, and let's figure this out together. But we don't know, let's not kid ourselves, we're not experts in this. This is new territory. And I think we can apply this same sort of principle to leadership and community engagement. So when I think about this, I think of you don't have to be an expert, but you have to be willing to be an experimenter. And so when we think about this in communities, just get in, get involved, and get engaged, and be willing to make mistakes. As an IxDA local lead, I've had book clubs of one, where I was the only one that showed up. And I just didn't do that anymore, right? I've had happy hours of one, because I forgot to promote it. I got too busy and I forgot to tell other people, hey, we're doing this thing. Yeah, lesson learned, don't do that again. So be able to make mistakes and experiment with things and try new things, but be willing to learn from it. All right, so the next thing I see that's often a problem is this idea of having events. And events are great, I love them, but I want to see us all move from having events to actually creating community, and they're two very different things. And I think we get wrapped up in how do we create events a lot. I do it, right? I produce a conference. And I see things like this, right? So this is from the conference just last month. someone tweeted that feeling that when you realize you found your tribe. And for me, when I see tweets like this, like, it's hard for me not to get worked up, because this is exactly what I want people to feel, and I hope that some of you are feeling this as well when you're here this weekend, feeling it and finding your tribe, finding the other people that think like you, right? You're not alone out there. But what happens, right? What happens on Monday when you're not at the conference anymore? So maybe you get something like Jack's tweet here where he's enjoying friendships that he's cultivated over the years in the Midwest UX community and making new ones this year. Well, that's great, but a year is a long time to wait to engage your community again. So this is something that I struggle with, and I don't have the answers yet, but this is something that I'm struggling with, trying to figure out how do we move from these events, these isolated things, to actually having a sustained community over the course of the entire year where we can have conversations. So one of the simple things that we've done with the local IxDA group is we just created a Facebook group where people can have conversations. And I'm ashamed to say that I probably stood in the way of this happening for at least a year or more because it didn't make sense to me. This wasn't how I used Facebook. But a lot of the community was in Facebook all the time. And so we added a group, and all of a sudden, people were getting jobs, people were connecting, people were sharing ideas, people were asking for advice and getting responses, people were sharing articles and communicating with each other outside of the monthly events that we had. So this has been great for the community. It's been a great way to pull new people in and get them to understand what are we about and what's okay, and how do we relate to each other outside of just the events that we have. So the next topic is build relationships and networks. And I think this is what we need to do as we try to move from having events to actually having communities. This idea of networks is you have all these people, right? And the power comes from the relationships between all these people, not just the people that are individuals, not just the nodes in the network, but those strings, those relationships that we have. So while we have a lot of events, sort of at the local IxDA level or any other sort of organization you might be involved with, I oftentimes think we're not doing enough to promote the relationships and to build connections between people. We come up and we have speakers and they give a lecture, or you have a workshop and you run through and you learn something, which is great. But are we creating the space to really build those connections and build those ties between people? And I'm not sure that we always are. So Give and Take is a project up in Minneapolis where they're trying to build sort of communities. It's not a design-related thing, but they say communities are more than the sum of the institutions and infrastructures. They're the sum of their relationships. And I think this really brings it home. We have to focus, as we're building these communities, focus on making connections between peoples, not just making or pushing content out to everybody so that we can learn something. So how do we do this, right? I think we have to create spaces for other people to connect and grow. I think we do that by fostering openness, participation, and opportunities for others, right? As someone you're creating a group, you really have to think about others first, and how can we create opportunities for those other people? And I think to do that, we have to come at it from a place of humility and be humble and say, I'm curious about you and I want to learn about you. Tell me about yourself, and not just going in and telling someone about who you are and what you do. So I think these are the places, sort of the orientation that we need to have to start to build these relationships. So the fifth one is this idea of emergence. And it sort of comes in two flavors. One is we can't over-design, we can't over-control the things that we create, and we need to sort of meet people where they are. So the first one I think of this idea of naked streets, which is these places are popping up all over the place, right? This one is in Holland. There's one that's being proposed in Chicago now. And the idea is that it's a shared space, essentially. There aren't strict boundaries between the sidewalk, pedestrian space, and the cars where they drive, and the bicycles. And there's also no signs and no stoplights. And so people have to be mindful. They're not ceding their responsibility to the infrastructure of control. They have to take that responsibility on themselves. And I think that's important. And what we've seen from a lot of these studies and a lot of these actual projects is that there's less congestion, there's higher throughput, there's the same safety levels or even higher safety levels as there were before. And it's just a much more pleasant space to live. But these places aren't undesigned, right? There's a lot of thinking and a lot of planning and a lot of design that goes into them, but they come from an orientation of not controlling the community, not controlling what's happening, but let what's going to happen, and sort of get out of the way. Enough design to get out of the way and let people live their lives. And I think this is sort of the orientation we need to have when we think about our communities and how do we create our communities. Let people do what they're going to do, but create the space for them to do that. The second thing is meet people where they are. When I ran a software design studio for the last couple of years in Columbus, we had an event called Open Office Hours, where every Thursday from 4 to 6, we would open the doors and we would invite the public to come in, and they would come in and they would just talk design. Maybe they'd have a prototype that they wanted us to vet. Maybe they had an idea that they wanted us to get their opinion on. Maybe they were stuck on a specific design problem and they wanted some advice. And we weren't trying to get new clients. We were just trying to open our doors and sort of grow the community organically and say, hey, we have this knowledge and we want to share it with you because we want to up-level our community. And it was a really interesting thing that started to happen. We started to get a lot of young startups come in and just ask for advice and show us where they are, and we'd critique what they had, give them some direction, and then they'd go off and work for a week or two and come back and ask more things. And we also had independent designers coming in to the office hours just to collaborate and talk about design and see new projects that maybe hadn't seen before and contribute to those, all sort of with the effort of how do we make all of this better? How do we improve everyone's lives? How do we improve everyone's work? Not what can I get out of it? And we did that because we met people where they were. We didn't ask anything of them. We just said, what are you doing? What are you working on? And how can I help? And I think if we take that orientation towards the communities that we live in, we can do a lot of great things. So the final thing that I want to talk about is this idea that this community stuff, it's hard. It takes time. There's no quick fix. There's no silver bullet. There's no like magic fairy dust that can sprinkle on a community and all of a sudden, you know, we have all these bonds and networks and everything's happy. It takes a lot of effort to do this, and so you have to be willing to sort of put in the time and effort to build relationships. And one of the things, I think it was Christina Woodkey turned me onto this a while ago, but I found Amy Jo Kim's models of cooperative gaming, and I've started exploring this, and what can we learn from cooperative gaming that can teach us about community development and community building. And she has a lot of models. I'm only going to go through one here, where she's talking about sort of the stages of the life cycle of a player in this sense. So you have visitors, you have a novice and a regular, and then a leader and an elder. And then sort of she's revised this model to talk about sort of 3 stages of newbies, regulars, and enthusiasts. You need onboarding, habit building, and mastery is what they're looking for at each of these stages. So I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. How can I map this to the community work that I'm doing? So we take these players and we take these stages, and then she goes through and talks about some of the needs they have at each of these levels. And I think as local leaders and community developers, we do a really good job, and we sort of focus our energies here on creating content. How can we create content for our communities? How can we teach them and sort of up-level the skill set of the practitioners in our communities? But I think we forget a lot about, hey, there's a lot of new people. If we don't have new people coming into our communities, they're going to die soon. So we have to make sure that we're paying attention to those new people and understand and communicate what are our goals, what are we trying to achieve here, what's the purpose, and make them welcome. And I think we can't also forget sort of these leaders and that are looking for mastery. Are we giving them a path to evolve and sort of grow so that they don't say, hey, I'm not learning anything in this local community anymore, so I'm just not going to show up to the meetups anymore. But it's those people that have been around for a long time that have the knowledge that need to share with the rest of us and produce that content and welcome those newbies in. So we have to make sure that we're doing stuff to keep those elders around and engaged in the communities, and they're not just drifting off and doing their own thing. So with that, these are the sort of 6 guiding principles, if you will, of designing our communities. Take an active role in the things that you're doing. Don't just be a passive consumer of other people's effort. Be a facilitator of other people's success. Put other people before yourself and find a way to make them better. Try to drive beyond events to actually creating community. Focus on relationships and networks and building those out. And then allow for support and emergence. Don't just create these control structures, and don't let yourself get in the way of what the community wants to do. And all this soft skills and soft work, it's really hard, and it takes time. So understand that it's not going to turn around and sort of have a change right in the first couple months. So I want to leave you with this. If you take away one thing, right? What you give is what you get. So please give more than you take. And I think if we do that and we sort of live by this mantra, we'll all have stronger communities in the end. So thank you.